A starving black boy stands before a judge, his voice cracking as he pleads, "I'm starving. Please help." The judge's reaction leaves the courtroom stunned, but what follows will shake the system to its core. What led this boy to such a heartbreaking plea? And how does his cry for help reveal a truth that could change everything? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the grimy windows of Jerry's corner store. 9-year-old Jaden Daniels, a 9-year-old black boy, stood outside, his thin frame shivering despite the warm spring day. His worn sneakers, 2 sizes too small, had holes that let in the cold from the concrete sidewalk. The oversized t-shirt hung loosely on his small frame, its faded blue color matching the despair in his dark eyes. A gentle breeze ruffled his unkempt hair, carrying with it the tempting aroma of fresh bread from the bakery down the street. Jaden's stomach growled loudly, a painful reminder of why he was here. He hadn't eaten since yesterday morning when his neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, had shared her last piece of bread with him. His mother was working double shifts again, trying to make ends meet while his father sat in prison for a crime he didn't commit. The thought of his father made his heart ache even more than his empty stomach. Taking a deep breath, Jaden pushed open the heavy glass door. The bell above chimed cheerfully, a stark contrast to the anxiety churning in his empty stomach. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, illuminating shelves stocked with colorful packages of food that seemed to mock his hunger. The sweet scent of fresh fruit mixed with the artificial smell of cleaning products, making his mouth water. Behind the counter stood Mr. Peterson, the store owner, his weathered face set in its usual stern expression. He looked up from his newspaper, his eyes narrowing as they followed Jaden's careful movements through the store. His thick fingers drummed impatiently on the counter's scratched surface. Jaden approached the counter, his hands trembling. "Please," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just need a little food." His eyes dropped to the floor, unable to meet Mr. Peterson's harsh gaze. He could feel the weight of other customers' stares on his back. "No handouts," Mr. Peterson snapped, folding his newspaper with sharp, angry movements. "This isn't a charity. Either buy something or leave." The fluorescent light caught the silver of his thinning hair, making his scowl appear even more intimidating. Jaden's throat tightened. "Sir, I haven't eaten since yesterday. Maybe I could sweep the store, or—" "I said no." Mr. Peterson's voice rose, causing Jaden to flinch. "Now get out before I call the police." His hand slapped against the counter, making the nearby candy display rattle. But Jaden couldn't move. The thought of another night with an empty stomach made him desperate. "Please," he tried again, his voice cracking. "Just a piece of bread. Anything." His fingers twisted the hem of his oversized shirt nervously. Mr. Peterson's face reddened with anger. He reached for the phone on the counter, his fingers jabbing at the buttons. "Yes, police? I have a loiterer in my store. Won't leave when asked. Probably looking to steal something." His voice carried through the quiet store, drawing disapproving looks from the few customers browsing the aisles. Jaden's heart pounded in his chest. "No, sir, I wouldn't steal. I just—" But Mr. Peterson had already turned his back, speaking in low tones to the dispatcher. Jaden stood rooted to the spot, tears welling up in his eyes. The minutes ticked by slowly, marked only by the steady buzz of the fluorescent lights and the occasional rumble of his empty stomach. An elderly woman shuffled past him, clutching her purse tighter as she hurried by. The police arrived quickly, their cruiser's lights painting the store windows in alternating flashes of red and blue. 2 officers entered, their heavy boots squeaking against the linoleum floor. The sound echoed through the now silent store. "That's him," Mr. Peterson said, pointing at Jaden. "Been hanging around, refusing to leave. Probably casing the place." His voice dripped with accusation. The taller officer approached Jaden, his hand resting on his belt. "Son, the store owner asked you to leave. Why are you still here?" His badge gleamed under the harsh store lighting. Tears spilled down Jaden's cheeks. "I'm just hungry," he whispered. The words caught in his throat, coming out as barely more than a breath. Despite his explanation, the officer pulled out his handcuffs. The cold metal clicked around Jaden's small wrists, the cuffs so large they had to be tightened to their smallest setting. The sound echoed in his ears, mixing with the rushing of blood and the pounding of his heart. A small crowd had gathered near the store's entrance, their whispers adding to his humiliation. They led him outside, past the curious onlookers who had gathered on the sidewalk. Jaden's face burned with shame as he was guided into the back of the police car. The tears flowed freely now, leaving wet trails down his dirt-smudged cheeks. A young mother pulled her child closer as they passed, as if hunger might be contagious. Through the window, he watched as the store grew smaller, Mr. Peterson's stern face visible through the glass. The police car's interior smelled of plastic and cleaning solution, the seat cold and hard beneath him. His stomach growled again, a painful reminder of why he was here. The handcuffs bit into his thin wrists with every small movement. Jaden stared out the window, watching his neighborhood pass by in a blur. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, but he couldn't find any beauty in it. His hope, like the day, was fading fast. Each street they passed took him further from home, and the weight of his situation pressed down on his small shoulders like a heavy blanket. Judge Harold Carmichael sat straight-backed on the bench, his black robes pressed and pristine, as he listened to the prosecutor's closing arguments. The afternoon light filtered through the high courtroom windows, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. He'd heard thousands of cases in this very room, but today felt different somehow. Heavier, like the air itself was thick with unspoken tension. "Your Honor, given the defendant's prior record, we recommend the maximum sentence of—" The prosecutor's voice cut off as the heavy courtroom doors creaked open. Two police officers entered, gently guiding a small boy between them. Harold's eyes fixed on the child's face, hollow-cheeked and tear-stained. The boy's clothes hung loose on his thin frame, and his sneakers were worn nearly through the soles. The sight stirred something deep in Harold's chest, a memory of his own childhood when his father had been wrongly accused. Whispers rippled through the courtroom. "Poor thing," someone murmured. "He's just a baby," another voice added. Harold watched as the officers led the boy to a nearby bench, noting how his shoulders trembled despite the warmth of the room. "Proceed," Harold instructed the prosecutor, though his attention kept drifting to the child. There was something in those eyes, a desperate determination that seemed far too mature for his young face. Suddenly, the boy shot to his feet. "Please!" His voice cracked with emotion, echoing off the high ceiling. "I'm starving. Please help." "Order," Harold called out automatically, but the boy continued, his words tumbling out in a rush of pain and desperation. "My daddy's in prison, but he didn't do anything wrong." Tears streamed down his face. "My name is Jaden Daniels, and my daddy is Malik Daniels. He's been locked up for 3 years for something he never did." His small chest heaved with sobs. "Mom works all the time now, but we still don't have enough food. I haven't eaten since yesterday morning." The courtroom fell silent. Harold felt his professional mask beginning to crack as Jaden's words hit him like physical blows. "The police wouldn't listen when Daddy tried to tell them he was innocent," Jaden continued, his voice growing hoarse. "Nobody would listen. And now I'm hungry, and Mom cries every night, and Daddy's missing everything." His legs wobbled, and one of the officers steadied him gently. Harold's hands gripped the edge of his bench, his knuckles white. The name Malik Daniels stirred a memory, a case file he'd reviewed months ago, one that had given him pause, but that he'd ultimately set aside, too caught up in his daily routine to dig deeper. The weight of his inaction crashed down on him. How many other Malik Daniels had he overlooked? How many other children like Jaden were suffering because he'd chosen the easy path of maintaining the status quo? Harold raised a trembling hand to his face, feeling moisture gather beneath his fingers. His carefully maintained judicial demeanor crumbled as he looked at Jaden through blurred vision. The boy's raw honesty had stripped away years of professional detachment, leaving Harold's heart exposed and aching. "This boy's father deserves a second chance," he murmured to himself, his voice thick with emotion. The words felt like both a confession and a promise, echoing in the hushed courtroom like a prayer. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the Venetian blinds in Judge Harold Carmichael's chambers as he gestured for Jaden to take a seat in one of the worn leather chairs facing his imposing mahogany desk. The boy's scuffed sneakers barely touched the floor, and his hands were clasped tightly in his lap, knuckles white with tension. His threadbare t-shirt hung loose on his thin frame. Harold removed his black judicial robe and carefully draped it over his high-backed chair, hoping to appear less intimidating to the nervous child before him. He settled into a seat with a creak of leather and leaned forward, his voice gentle and encouraging. "Tell me everything, Jaden. I want to hear about your father." Jaden's eyes darted around the wood-paneled room, taking in the towering bookshelves filled with leather-bound law books and the impressive array of framed diplomas on the walls. The grandeur of the chamber seemed to make him shrink even smaller in his seat. He swallowed hard before speaking, his voice barely above a whisper. "My dad, he's been in prison for 3 years now, but he didn't do it, sir. He really didn't." "What happened?" Harold asked softly, noting how Jaden's shoulders trembled slightly beneath the worn fabric of his shirt. "It was a robbery at a convenience store," Jaden explained, his voice growing steadier as he spoke, as if he'd told this story many times before. "Dad was walking home from his second job that night. He cleaned offices after his warehouse shift. The police said he matched the description, but the security camera was broken, and the witness only saw someone tall, wearing dark clothes." Tears welled up in his dark eyes. "That was enough for them to arrest him." Harold felt a knot forming in his stomach as Jaden continued, each word making his professional facade harder to maintain. "The trial was so fast. Dad's lawyer barely talked to him, maybe 20 minutes total. The jury only took 2 hours to say he was guilty." Jaden wiped his eyes with the frayed sleeve of his shirt. "Mom got really sick after that. Depression, the doctor said. She can't work anymore. Some days she can barely get out of bed." The boy's words hit Harold like physical blows, each revelation adding to his growing discomfort. He thought of his own father, wrongly arrested decades ago, and how that injustice had shaped his life and career choices. But this was different, worse. The system he'd sworn to uphold, the one he'd dedicated his life to serving, had failed this family completely. "We lost our house," Jaden added quietly, staring at his worn sneakers. "The food stamps aren't enough. I try to help Mom, but—" His voice cracked, revealing the weight of responsibility no child should have to bear. "I just want my dad back." Harold rose from his chair and walked to the window, trying to maintain his composure as memories of his own past merged with the present injustice before him. The weight of his role in the system that had torn this family apart pressed down on him like a physical burden. He turned back to face Jaden, seeing not just a hungry child, but a mirror of systemic failures that had gone unchallenged for far too long. Jaden, Harold said, his voice thick with emotion as he returned to his desk, his decision already crystallizing in his mind. I will look into your father's case. You have my word on that. Camille Harris, a determined 28-year-old attorney, sits across from Harold as he explains Malik's case. The morning light filtered through the windows of Harold's chambers as Camille Harris sat across from him, her dark hair neatly pulled back, professional yet approachable in her navy blazer. The soft glow cast long shadows across the room, highlighting the worry lines etched on both their faces. She carefully examined the case file spread across the mahogany desk, her finger tracing each line of text, occasionally pausing to make notes in her small leather-bound notebook. The witness statements are contradictory, she noted, her voice steady but tinged with concern. And the physical evidence... She shook her head, pulling out another document, the paper crinkling beneath her fingers. There's barely anything here that connects Mr. Daniels to the crime. It's almost as if they were determined to build a case, regardless of the facts. Harold nodded, removing his reading glasses and rubbing his tired eyes. The sleepless nights spent reviewing the case were evident in the dark circles beneath them. I've been reviewing everything since Jaden came to see me. The more I look, the more troubled I become. He gestured to a particular page, the paper worn from repeated handling. Look at the timeline. Malik was working his second job that night, but his alibi was barely investigated. They didn't even interview his supervisor. Camille's brown eyes narrowed as she read further, her jaw tightening with each new revelation. The public defender only spent 45 minutes with him before trial. She looked up, disbelief evident on her face. That's nowhere near adequate representation. Even a first-year law student would know better. I know, Harold said quietly, his hands clasped tightly on the desk. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on his shoulders, making him look older than his years. You should have seen his son, Camille. 9 years old, hungry, desperate enough to try stealing food. His voice cracked slightly, and he cleared his throat before continuing. That boy reminded me why I became a judge. We need to make this right. Camille sat back in her chair, studying the older man's face. The usual judicial stoicism had given way to something raw and genuine, a transformation that spoke volumes about the gravity of the situation. She pulled another document from the stack, scanning it quickly, her trained eye catching details others might miss. The arresting officer's report has inconsistencies, too. The suspect description changed 3 times before they arrested Mr. Daniels. First, they were looking for someone shorter, then taller, then suddenly Malik fit the profile perfectly. Harold leaned forward, his chair creaking beneath the movement. Will you help? I know it's asking a lot. This case could be politically sensitive, especially given my position. There might be pushback from people who'd prefer these questions remain unasked. Camille straightened the papers, aligning them perfectly before placing them back in the folder. Her mind was already racing with potential leads to follow, witnesses to re-interview, evidence to re-examine. The familiar surge of determination that had driven her through countless cases rose within her. I'll investigate, she said firmly, meeting Harold's gaze. Whatever it takes to uncover the truth, every stone will be turned. The relief on Harold's face was visible as his tense shoulders relaxed slightly. A glimmer of hope sparked in his eyes. Thank you, Camille. I know your track record. You're thorough, dedicated. If anyone can find what was missed, it's you. Your reputation for attention to detail precedes you. I'll start by reviewing all the original evidence, Camille said, tucking the file into her briefcase with practiced precision. Then I want to talk to Malik himself. Sometimes the smallest detail can break a case wide open. Her determination was evident in every precise movement, every carefully chosen word. The weight of the task ahead settled around her like a familiar cloak. Harold stood, walking to the window. The morning sun cast his shadow long across the floor. "A man's freedom hangs in the balance," he said softly, his reflection faint in the glass. "And a little boy needs his father. We can't fail them." "I understand the stakes," Camille assured him, rising from her chair. She adjusted her blazer, her posture straight and confident despite the pressure of the moment. "I'll find what they missed. Whatever the truth is, we'll uncover it. Malik and Jaden deserve nothing less than our absolute best efforts." The stairwell creaked under Jaden's feet as he climbed the 4 flights to their apartment. Each step felt heavier than the last, his muscles aching from the long walk home. The hallway was dark, with only a sliver of late afternoon sun seeping through a grimy window at the end of the corridor. Jaden's key scraped against the lock before finally turning. The apartment was eerily quiet and stuffy, the air conditioning silent due to the power being cut off. Through the dim light, he could make out his mother's figure on their worn-out couch. "Mom?" he called softly, his heart tightening at the sight of her. Elaine Daniels lay still, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. Her face, once full of life and warmth, had become gaunt and pale. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, making them appear sunken in the fading light. "Jaden!" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Is that you, baby?" He rushed to her side, kneeling beside the couch. His hand found hers, and he squeezed it gently. The bones felt sharp beneath her paper-thin skin. "I'm here, Mom. I'm sorry I was gone so long." Jaden glanced toward their small kitchen. The refrigerator stood silent, its interior as empty as his stomach. Bills marked final notice littered the coffee table, their red stamps visible even in the dim light. "Are you hungry?" Elaine tried to sit up, but her arms trembled with the effort. "I think we still have some crackers." "No, Mom, please rest." Jaden helped her lie back down, adjusting the thin blanket around her shoulders. "I have good news. I met someone today, a judge. He's going to help us with Dad's case." Elaine's eyes, though tired, sparked with a hint of interest. "A judge?" "Yes," Jaden said, his voice growing stronger with enthusiasm. "He listened to me, Mom. Really listened. He promised to help us." He squeezed her hand again. "The judge is going to look into Dad's case. Dad's going to come home." A faint smile crossed Elaine's lips, but her voice wavered as she spoke. "That would be wonderful, baby." The words carried a weight of doubt that she couldn't quite hide. Years of disappointment making hope feel dangerous. "It's different this time," Jaden insisted, though his mother's doubt made his own chest tighten. "The judge had tears in his eyes when I told him about us. He believes Dad is innocent." Elaine reached up with a shaky hand to touch her son's cheek. "You're such a brave boy," she whispered, "just like your father." As darkness settled over the apartment, Jaden retrieved the picture he kept under his pillow. A photo of Malik Daniels at a family picnic, his smile bright and genuine, his arms wrapped around a younger Jaden and a healthier Elaine. The edges were worn from countless nights of being held. Jaden settled onto the floor beside the couch, close to his mother. His stomach growled loudly in the quiet room, but he tried to ignore it. He held the picture against his chest, feeling the frame's corners press against his skin through his thin t-shirt. "Good night, Mom," he whispered. "Good night, my brave boy." Elaine's voice drifted down, already heavy with exhaustion. Jaden curled up on the hard floor, the photo clutched tightly in his hands. His empty stomach protested again, but he closed his eyes, trying to focus on the judge's promise instead of his hunger. Sleep came slowly, accompanied by dreams of his father's return and his mother's smile becoming bright once more. Camille sat at her desk, surrounded by stacks of papers from Malik Daniels' case file. The setting sun cast long shadows through her office window, but she barely noticed the time passing. Her fingers traced each line of the trial transcript, her frown deepening with every page she turned. The thick manila folders were spread across her desk, like pieces of a disturbing puzzle she couldn't quite solve. "This can't be right," she muttered, spreading out the witness statements side by side. Her hands trembled slightly as she arranged the papers. The convenience store robbery had allegedly occurred at 9:15 p.m., but the primary witness claimed to have seen Malik running from the scene at 8:45 p.m. Another witness described a suspect wearing a red hoodie, while others mentioned a blue jacket. The glaring inconsistencies made her head spin. She grabbed her yellow legal pad, already filled with notes, and added another bullet point. Her pen moved quickly across the paper, capturing every discrepancy. The handwriting at the top read, "Timeline Inconsistencies," in bold letters, followed by a growing list of problems that now covered most of the page. Her coffee had gone cold hours ago, but Camille barely noticed as she took another sip, grimacing at the bitter taste. The more she read, the more her stomach churned with a mixture of disbelief and outrage. The entire trial had lasted less than 2 days, a shockingly brief period for a case with such serious implications. The public defender had called no witnesses for Malik's defense, not even character witnesses who could have vouched for him. The prosecution's case relied entirely on eyewitness testimony that contradicted itself repeatedly and should have raised red flags for everyone involved. "Where's the security footage?" Camille flipped through the evidence log again, her fingers catching on dog-eared pages. "Every convenience store has cameras. Where's the footage?" Her voice echoed in the empty office. She found a single note buried in the file. "Security system malfunctioning on night in question." No further investigation had been conducted, no technician's report filed, no attempt to recover any partial footage. Camille's hand tightened around her pen until her knuckles turned white, the plastic creaking under the pressure. The evidence was flimsy at best, yet Malik had been convicted in record time. She thought of Jaden's hollow cheeks and Elaine's illness, visible signs of a family struggling to survive. A family torn apart based on contradictory testimonies and a broken security system that no one had bothered to properly investigate. "They didn't even try," she whispered, her voice trembling with anger that threatened to overwhelm her professional composure. The prosecution had rushed through the case. The defense had barely participated, and the judge had allowed it all to happen. A black man accused of robbery. They'd simply gone through the motions, assuming his guilt from the start. The casual injustice of it made her feel sick. Camille stood up abruptly, her chair rolling back against the wall with a loud thud. She paced her small office, running her hands through her hair in frustration, loose strands falling from her once neat bun. The justice system was supposed to protect people, to ensure fair trials and thorough investigations. Instead, Malik Daniels had been railroaded into a conviction that had destroyed his family, and nobody had seemed to care enough to look deeper. Her eyes fell on a family photo tucked into the corner of Malik's file. Malik, Elaine, and a much younger Jaden at what looked like a birthday party. Jaden was missing his front teeth in a wide grin, chocolate cake smeared on his cheek. Their smiles were bright, genuine, full of joy. The contrast between that happy moment and their current situation made her chest ache with almost physical pain. With shaking hands, Camille picked up her phone and dialed Judge Carmichael's number. Her heart pounded as she waited. It rang 3 times before he answered. "Judge Harold Carmichael speaking." Camille's voice was tight with barely contained emotion, her words carrying the weight of everything she'd discovered. "We need to talk. This case is worse than I thought." Harold sat in his dimly lit study, the aged leather of his chair creaking as he leaned forward to examine the worn photograph on his mahogany desk. The image showed a younger version of his father, James Carmichael, standing proudly in his crisp factory uniform outside the sprawling manufacturing plant where he'd worked for 15 years. The edges of the photo were frayed and yellowed with age, but his father's warm, confident smile remained as clear as the day it was taken. His fingers trembled as they traced the outline of his father's face, filing the slight indentations in the paper's surface. The memory of that terrible day crashed over him like a wave. The police showing up at their door on a quiet Sunday morning, the harsh accusations of theft from the factory, the look of utter devastation on his father's face as they led him away in handcuffs while the neighbors watched from their windows. "They didn't even investigate properly," Harold whispered to the empty room, his voice echoing slightly against the book-lined walls. His throat tightened painfully as he remembered his mother crying at their kitchen table, unpaid bills piling up like autumn leaves as she tried desperately to scrape together enough money for a decent lawyer. The factory had eventually dropped the charges when the real thief confessed, but by then, the irreparable damage was done. His father had spent 3 hellish weeks in jail, lost his job of 15 years, and their family's reputation in their small, close-knit community was permanently stained. James Carmichael was never the same after that, the proud glint in his eyes replaced by a haunted, distant look that never fully went away, even on his best days. Harold stood up abruptly, his chair rolling backward as he began pacing the length of his wood-paneled study. The stark similarities between his father's case and Malik's situation struck him like physical blows to the chest. The rushed investigation, the immediate presumption of guilt, the devastating ripple effect on the family left behind. It was all painfully, sickeningly familiar. "I became a judge to prevent this exact thing from happening," he said aloud, his voice thick with emotion and self-reproach. "But what have I really done to change anything?" He stopped at his window, staring at his reflection in the darkened glass, barely recognizing the man looking back at him. How many times had he simply accepted the prosecution's version of events without question? How many times had he looked the other way, when public defenders were clearly overwhelmed and unprepared to properly defend their clients? The image of young Jaden's desperate, pleading face flashed in his mind, overlapping with vivid memories of himself as a child, waiting anxiously outside the county jail to visit his father. The same raw fear, the same gut-wrenching confusion, the same crushing sense of helplessness. Nothing had changed in all these years. "I've been part of the problem all along," Harold admitted, the words tasting bitter and acidic in his mouth. He told himself he was being impartial, following the letter of the law. But in reality, he had become just another unfeeling cog in the very machine that had nearly destroyed his own family. Returning to his desk with heavy steps, Harold picked up the photo again, studying every detail of his father's face. His father had passed away 5 years ago, never fully recovering from the deep-seated shame of his wrongful arrest. The system had failed James Carmichael completely, just as it was now failing Malik Daniels and countless others like him. Hot tears welled in Harold's eyes as he finally made his decision, his resolve hardening like steel. "I won't let another family go through this nightmare," he declared firmly to the silent room. "Not Jaden, not anyone else." He placed the photo carefully back on his desk, his father's smile seeming to take on new meaning, a call to action that had waited years to be answered. "I'll fight for Malik, Dad. I'll fight for all of them. It's time to make this right, no matter what it costs me." Camille sat across from Jerome Banks in a small coffee shop on the outskirts of town. The mid-afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows as Jerome fidgeted with his paper cup, his eyes darting nervously around the nearly empty establishment. The aroma of fresh coffee and pastries filled the air, but neither of them seemed interested in the food displayed behind the glass counter. "Mr. Banks, I know this isn't easy," Camille said softly, keeping her voice steady and reassuring. "But anything you can tell me about Malik Daniels' case could make a real difference." She noticed how his weathered hands gripped the cup too tightly, his knuckles turning white with tension. Jerome's hands trembled slightly as he took a sip of his coffee, leaving a ring of moisture on the worn wooden table. "I never wanted to lie," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But that prosecutor, Mr. Moore, he didn't give me much choice." Beads of sweat formed on his forehead despite the cool air conditioning. Camille leaned forward, her heart racing. She pressed the record button on her phone, sliding it discreetly between them on the scratch tabletop. "Can you tell me exactly what happened?" Jerome's shoulders slumped as he stared into his coffee, watching the dark liquid ripple with his trembling. "I had some prior convictions, nothing major, but Moore said he'd make sure I went away for a long time if I didn't testify against Malik." His voice cracked slightly, thick with emotion. "He told me exactly what to say in court, that I saw Malik running from the store that night. Made me repeat it over and over until it sounded natural." "But you didn't actually see him there?" Camille asked, working to keep her voice neutral despite the anger building inside her. She could feel her fingernails digging into her palms under the table. "No, ma'am. I was nowhere near that store that night." Jerome's hands clenched around his cup, threatening to crush it. "Moore said it didn't matter what the truth was. Said he needed to close the case. And Malik—" He paused, swallowing hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "He said Malik fit the profile they were looking for." Camille felt sick to her stomach as the implications of Jerome's words sank in. The familiar coffee shop suddenly felt stifling. "So Prosecutor Moore deliberately coached you to give false testimony?" "Yes." Jerome's voice grew stronger, as if unburdening himself gave him courage. His posture straightened slightly. "He had me memorize the statement, made me practice it until he was satisfied. Said if I messed up or told anyone, he'd make sure I regretted it. He knew about my family, where my kids went to school, everything." Tears welled in Jerome's eyes, catching the sunlight streaming through the window. "I've carried this guilt for years, knowing an innocent man was in prison because of my lies, because I was too scared to stand up to Moore. Sometimes I can't even look my children in the eyes." Camille reached across the table, placing her hand gently on Jerome's arm. His skin felt cold despite the warm day. "You're doing the right thing now, Mr. Banks. That's what matters." After recording Jerome's full statement, Camille drove straight to Harold's chambers, her hands shaking with a mixture of anger and excitement as she played the recording for him. The late afternoon traffic barely registered as her mind raced with the implications of Jerome's confession. "This is the break we needed," she told Harold, watching his face darken as he listened to Jerome's confession. The gravity of the situation settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Sarah Blake, a fearless investigative journalist, meets with Harold and Camille. Sarah Blake strode into Harold's chambers, her laptop tucked under one arm and a well-worn leather messenger bag slung across her shoulder. The strap had begun to fray at the edges, testament to countless investigations and late-night stakeouts. Her sharp eyes took in both Harold and Camille, who were already seated at the conference table, their postures tense with anticipation. "Judge Carmichael, Ms. Harris," she said, settling into a chair and smoothing her blazer. "Your message sounded urgent." Harold nodded, his face grave, fingers interlaced on the polished wood before him. "What we're about to share with you needs to be handled carefully." He gestured to Camille, who pulled out her phone with steady hands. As Jerome's recorded confession played, Sarah's expression grew increasingly focused, her brow furrowing deeper with each revelation. She pulled out a small notepad, its corners dog-eared from constant use, her pen moving rapidly across the page. When the recording ended, she looked up, her jaw set with determination, a familiar fire kindling in her eyes. Coerced testimony, targeting a black defendant with flimsy evidence. Sarah shook her head, disgust evident in her tone. Unfortunately, this sounds familiar. I've seen this playbook before. Camille spread out several documents from Malik's case file, the papers rustling against the wooden surface. The timeline doesn't add up, the witness statements are inconsistent, and the physical evidence is practically non-existent. It's like they built a house of cards and called it justice. Yet Moore pushed it through anyway, Harold added, his voice heavy with regret, shoulders sagging slightly. And I didn't question it enough at the time. I was part of the problem. Sarah opened her laptop, the keys clicking rapidly under her fingers, flying across the keyboard. Franklin Moore has one of the highest conviction rates in the state. I've always wondered how he managed that. She turned the screen to show them a spreadsheet filled with damning statistics. I've been collecting data on his cases for months. The racial disparity in his prosecutions is striking, and it's not even subtle once you look at the numbers. You think there's a pattern? Camille leaned forward, studying the numbers, her legal mind already connecting the dots. I'm almost certain of it. Sarah pulled up another file, her movements quick and precise. Moore's office has prosecuted a disproportionate number of black defendants, often with circumstantial evidence at best. But nobody's connected the dots because the cases were spread out over years. He's been careful about that. Harold rubbed his temples, the weight of responsibility evident in his gesture. If we can prove systematic discrimination, it could overturn dozens of convictions, Camille finished, her eyes wide with the implications. We could help so many families. Sarah closed her laptop with a decisive click that echoed in the chamber. I'll need to dig deeper, track down other witnesses, review more case files, follow the money trail. She looked directly at Harold, her gaze unflinching. This won't be easy. Moore has powerful friends, and they won't want this story told. They'll fight back hard. Whatever you need, Harold assured her, his voice firm with renewed purpose. We have to make this right, no matter the cost. Sarah stood, gathering her things with practiced efficiency. If what I suspect is true, this is bigger than just Malik's case. We might be looking at decades of systematic abuse of power. Camille sat at her desk late into the night, surrounded by towering stacks of case files and legal documents that cast long shadows in the dim light of her desk lamp. Her eyes burned from hours of reading, and her third cup of coffee had long since gone cold, but she couldn't stop. Something about Malik's arrest report had been nagging at her all day, like a persistent itch she couldn't quite reach. She pulled out the original police report again, spreading the wrinkled pages across her cluttered desk. The description of the suspect was maddeningly vague. African-American male, approximately 6 feet tall, wearing dark clothing. Her stomach churned as she read it for the 10th time, her fingers tracing the faded type on the photocopied page. That's it? She whispered to herself, anger rising in her chest like a hot tide. That's all they needed to ruin a man's life? The more she dug through the files, the worse it got. There was no physical evidence linking Malik to the robbery. Not a single shred. No fingerprints, no security camera footage, no stolen items found in his possession. Just a witness who claimed to have seen someone matching that broad description running from the scene in the darkness of night. Camille's hands began to shake as she pieced it together, her legal pad filled with hastily scribbled notes. Malik had been walking home from his late shift at the warehouse that night, taking his usual route through that neighborhood, the same route he'd taken for 3 years without incident. He was black, tall, and wearing his dark work uniform, That was all it took for the police to arrest him and tear him away from his family. She grabbed her phone and dialed Harold's number, not caring that it was nearly midnight. Her heart pounded with the urgency of her discovery. "Judge Carmichael," she said when he answered, her voice tight with barely contained emotion. "I need you to see this right now. It can't wait until morning." 20 minutes later, they sat in Harold's wood-paneled home office, the antique desk lamp casting a warm glow over their worried faces. Camille spread the documents across his polished desk, pointing out the glaring holes in the case with trembling fingers. "Look at this," she said, jabbing her finger at the arrest report, her voice rising with indignation. "No evidence, no real investigation. They saw a black man walking home from work and decided he was guilty." Her voice cracked with fury and unshed tears. "They didn't care about justice. They just wanted someone to blame, and Malik was convenient." Harold picked up the report with trembling hands, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. His face grew darker as he read, the weight of what they were uncovering settling heavily on his shoulders like a physical burden. Years of experience told him this wasn't just incompetence. This was deliberate indifference to a man's life and liberty, a pattern he'd seen too many times before. "How many others?" he muttered, more to himself than to Camille, his voice heavy with regret. "How many other lives have we destroyed with this kind of negligence? How many families are torn apart?" Camille watched as Harold stood and walked to his window, staring out into the dark night. The streetlights cast shadows across his troubled face, highlighting the deep lines of concern etched around his eyes. When he turned back to her, his face was set with grim determination. "We're going to expose this," he said firmly, his voice carrying the weight of a solemn vow. Sarah Blake's fingers flew across her keyboard as she compiled her findings into a spreadsheet, her heart pounding with each new revelation. The numbers were staggering and made her blood run cold. Over the past 5 years, Franklin Moore had prosecuted 287 cases. Of those, 198 involved black defendants. The conviction rate for black defendants was 94%, while for white defendants, it was only 47%. The statistical disparity was so extreme, it couldn't possibly be a random chance. Her small office at the Daily Chronicle was cluttered with stacks of court records and financial documents, the paper trail of corruption spreading across every available surface. Empty coffee cups littered her desk, evidence of the long hours she'd spent following the money trail, each cup representing another sleepless night spent pursuing justice. The wall behind her was covered in sticky notes of different colors, each one connecting another dot in the corrupt system she was uncovering, creating a complex web of deceit that made her head spin. "This can't be a coincidence," she muttered, rubbing her tired eyes until spots danced in her vision. "The pattern is too perfect, too calculated." Sarah pulled up another document, a financial report from Midwest Correctional Facilities, a private prison company that had been expanding rapidly in recent years. Her heart raced as she traced payment after payment flowing from the prison company through various shell corporations, each one more cleverly disguised than the last. The trail led straight to an offshore account connected to Franklin Moore, hidden behind layers of corporate facades, but unmistakably linked to the corrupt prosecutor. The prison company paid for every conviction, treating human lives like commodities to be traded. More prisoners meant more profit, more government funding, more opportunities for expansion. And Moore had been filling their cells systematically with black men, many convicted on evidence as flimsy as what was used against Malik Daniels, destroying families and communities in the process. Her stomach churned as she discovered a memo detailing target demographics for arrests and convictions, the corporate language failing to disguise its sinister intent. It was carefully worded in sanitized business speak, But the meaning was clear. They were deliberately targeting minority communities, turning racism into a profitable enterprise. Sarah leaned back in her chair, feeling physically ill as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. After 20 years as an investigative journalist, she thought she'd seen everything: corruption, greed, abuse of power. But this was different, more insidious. This wasn't just one corrupt prosecutor or a few bad decisions made in the heat of the moment. This was an entire system designed to profit from racial discrimination, a machine built to crush the vulnerable. She reached for her phone with trembling hands and dialed Judge Carmichael's number, knowing this evidence would change everything. "Judge," she said when he answered, her voice heavy with emotion and barely contained anger, "I found something. It's worse than we thought. Much worse than anyone could have imagined." She heard Harold take a deep breath on the other end of the line, preparing himself for bad news. "Tell me everything." Franklin Moore isn't just targeting black defendants by chance. He's part of a larger scheme with private prisons. They're paying him for convictions, Harold. They have actual quotas. She paused, struggling to keep her voice steady as rage and disgust threatened to overwhelm her. This isn't just one bad prosecutor. This is a broken system, rotten to its core. The silence on the other end of the line spoke volumes. Sarah could almost feel Harold's horror matching her own, the weight of the revelation settling heavily between them. "How deep does it go?" he finally asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. "I'm still digging, but I've found connections to judges, police chiefs, even politicians. The private prison company has been spreading money everywhere, buying influence like candy." She glanced at her wall of evidence, the sticky notes suddenly looking like accusations. "They've created a pipeline, Harold. They're literally profiting from racism, turning prejudice into dollar signs." Sarah heard Harold exhale slowly, the sound full of pain and determination. She knew he was thinking about Jaden, about Malik, about all the families torn apart by this corrupt machine, lives destroyed for the sake of profit margins. "Send me everything you have," Harold said firmly, his judicial restraint giving way to righteous anger. "Every document, every connection, every piece of evidence. We're going to need it all to bring these people down." Sarah looked at her computer screen, at the damning numbers that revealed such a dark truth about their justice system, each statistic representing a human life destroyed by greed. "I'll have it to you within the hour," she replied, her determination hardening into steel. "These people need to be exposed, and we're going to make sure everyone knows what they've done." Now, Jaden was doing his homework at the rickety kitchen table when he heard the thud. The sound made his heart stop. He rushed to the living room where his mother had been resting on their worn-out couch. "Mom." His voice cracked as he saw Elaine sprawled on the floor, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Her skin looked waxy and pale, almost gray in the dim light filtering through their dusty windows. With trembling hands, Jaden grabbed his mother's old phone from the coffee table. He dialed 911, his fingers slipping on the cracked screen. "Please," he whispered as the operator answered. "My mom collapsed. She's breathing, but she won't wake up." The minutes waiting for the ambulance felt like hours. Jaden held his mother's cold hand, trying to warm it between his palms. "Hold on, Mom. Please, hold on." When the paramedics arrived, their heavy boots thundered up the apartment stairs. They worked quickly, asking Jaden questions he struggled to answer through his fear. He watched helplessly as they lifted his mother onto a stretcher, her thin frame looking impossibly fragile under the bright fluorescent lights of the hallway. In the emergency room, Jaden sat alone in a hard plastic chair, his legs swinging anxiously above the linoleum floor. The antiseptic smell made his empty stomach turn. Doctors and nurses rushed past, their faces blurring together until one finally stopped to talk to him. "Your mother is severely malnourished," the doctor explained gently, looking at Jaden over his clipboard. "Her body isn't getting the nutrients it needs. Has she been eating regularly?" Jaden's throat tightened. He thought about their empty fridge, about splitting his school lunch with her, about the nights they went to bed hungry. We try," he managed to say, his voice barely a whisper. The doctor's face softened with understanding and concern. "We're going to keep her here for a few days. She needs proper nutrition and monitoring." After the doctor left, Jaden found himself alone in his mother's hospital room. The steady beep of monitors filled the silence as tears began rolling down his cheeks. He'd tried so hard to take care of her, to be strong, but it wasn't enough. The weight of his failure pressed down on him until sobs shook his small frame. "Hey there, sweetheart," a gentle voice called from the doorway. A nurse with kind eyes and gray-streaked hair stepped into the room. She placed a warm hand on Jaden's shoulder. "Let it out. It's okay to cry." "I couldn't help her," Jaden choked out between sobs. "I'm supposed to take care of her while Dad's gone, but I couldn't even do that right." The nurse knelt beside him, meeting his tear-filled eyes. "Listen to me, honey. You're stronger than you think. Most grown-ups couldn't handle what you're dealing with, but here you are, still fighting. That takes real courage." Jaden wiped his eyes with his sleeve, looking at his mother's sleeping face. The hospital lights made her look even more fragile, like a paper doll that might blow away in a strong wind. He reached out and took her hand, careful not to disturb the IV line. "I'll fix this, Mom," he promised, his young voice filled with determination despite its trembling. "I'll bring Dad home." The words hung in the quiet hospital room, a child's vow against a world that seemed determined to break his family apart. Harold sat at his mahogany desk, sifting through the morning's mail. Among the usual court documents and official letters, a plain white envelope caught his eye. No return address, just his name typed in stark black letters. His fingers traced the edge of the envelope, a strange feeling of unease settling in his stomach. Opening it carefully, he pulled out a single sheet of paper. The message was brief, made from letters cut from magazines and newspapers. "Drop the case or face the consequences." Harold's hands began to tremble, causing the paper to rustle softly in the quiet of his chambers. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he read the words again. The threat was clear, and its anonymity made it all the more menacing. He placed the letter on his desk and leaned back in his chair, his heart pounding against his ribs. Images of Jaden's tearful face flashed through his mind, followed by memories of Elaine in her hospital bed. Then came the picture of his own father, wrongfully arrested all those years ago. Fear clawed at his throat, making it hard to breathe. He thought about his comfortable life, his respected position, everything he could lose by pursuing this case. The safe choice would be to step back, to let someone else fight this battle. But then he remembered Jerome's confession about being coerced, the pattern of injustice Sarah had uncovered, and the countless other families torn apart by a corrupt system. His fear began to mix with anger. Anger at himself for even considering giving in. Anger at those who would threaten him to maintain their power. Harold stood up and walked to his office fireplace. His hands still shook, but now with determination rather than fear. He struck a match and held the threatening letter to the flame. "You won't scare me away," he said aloud, watching as the paper curled and blackened in the fire. The community center buzzed with energy as people filed in, filling every available seat. Handmade signs dotted the crowd, bearing messages like "Free Malik Daniels" and "Justice Now." At the front of the room, Jaden stood behind a microphone. his small frame barely visible above the podium. His heart hammered in his chest as he looked out at the sea of faces. Some were neighbors he recognized, others complete strangers drawn by the story of his father's wrongful imprisonment. Local news cameras lined the back wall, their red lights blinking steadily. "My name is Jayden Daniels," he began, his voice quavering slightly. "And my dad has been in prison for 3 years for something he didn't do." He paused, taking a deep breath like his teacher had taught him for class presentations. "We lost our house because Mom got sick and couldn't work. Some nights I go to bed hungry." Jayden's voice grew stronger as he continued, fueled by the attentive faces before him. "But the hardest part is seeing my dad behind glass, knowing he should be home with us." In the crowd, several people wiped tears from their eyes. A woman in the front row nodded encouragingly, her own eyes glistening. "The police didn't look for the real robber," Jayden continued. "They just saw my dad was black and decided he was guilty. That's not fair. That's not right." His words rang through the room, clear and true. Phones raised throughout the audience, recording his speech. Social media was already lighting up with clips of the brave young boy speaking truth to power. Local news reporters scribbled in their notepads, their cameras focused on Jayden's earnest face. "My dad taught me that telling the truth matters. He taught me to be brave and stand up for what's right." Jayden's voice grew stronger with each word. "So I'm asking you to help us. Help us bring my dad home." The crowd erupted in applause, many rising to their feet. Chants of "Free Malik" filled the room. Jayden felt warmth spread through his chest as he watched people joining together for his father. News reporters rushed forward, microphones extended, eager to capture more of Jayden's story. The rally had drawn more attention than anyone expected, and social media was already buzzing with clips of his speech. Through the crowd, Jayden spotted Judge Harold standing near the back door. The judge gave him a subtle nod of approval, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. In that moment, Jayden felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Hope. Real, solid hope that things might finally change. Community leaders stepped forward, pledging their support. Local civil rights organizations promised to join the fight. The momentum was building, and Jayden could feel it. Each person in that room represented another voice calling for justice, another push toward bringing his father home. As camera flashes lit up the room and reporters continued to gather around him, Jayden stood a little taller. He wasn't just a hungry kid anymore. He was his father's voice, and people were finally listening. Camille's phone buzzed on her nightstand, jolting her from a fitful sleep. The clock read 11:47 p.m. Sarah Blake's name flashed on the screen, and Camille's stomach tightened with worry. "Sarah, what's wrong?" Camille asked, already sliding out of bed. "I found something. It's worse than we thought." Sarah's voice trembled with urgency. "You need to come to my office right now. I can't explain over the phone." Camille threw on clothes and grabbed her keys, her mind racing. The streets were nearly empty as she drove to Sarah's office building downtown. The usually bustling newspaper headquarters stood dark and quiet, except for the faint glow from Sarah's third-floor window. When Camille reached Sarah's office door, her heart stopped. Papers littered the hallway, and the door hung crooked on its hinges. Inside, the scene was devastating. File cabinets lay overturned, drawers pulled out and emptied. Computer equipment lay smashed on the floor. "Sarah?" Camille called out, her voice echoing in the chaos. Then she saw her, Sarah's crumpled form behind the desk, motionless. "Oh God, Sarah!" Camille rushed to her friend's side, checking for a pulse. It was there, steady but weak. In the distance, sirens wailed, growing closer. A neighbor must have heard the commotion and called the police. Sarah's eyelids fluttered, and she groaned softly. "Camille?" "I'm here," Don't try to move. Help is coming. Sarah grabbed Camille's arm with surprising strength. They know we're close. They'll do anything to stop us. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Who did this to you? Sarah's eyes darted around the room. I found the connection. Franklin Moore. He's been working with corrupt cops. They falsify reports, plant evidence, all targeting black men. She winced in pain. They get paid to make quick arrests, easy convictions. Moore handles the rest. Police officers and paramedics burst into the room. As they tended to Sarah, she pressed a USB drive into Camille's hand. Everything's here. Bank records, emails, names. Keep it safe. The paramedics carefully lifted Sarah onto a stretcher. Camille watched them wheel her friend away. The small drive clutched tightly in her fist. Her whole body shook with anger as she looked around the destroyed office. They'll regret this, she whispered, her voice hard with determination. Sarah lay in her hospital bed, her face bruised but her eyes fierce with determination. The steady beep of monitors filled the quiet room as sunlight filtered through the window blinds. Despite her injuries, she gripped Camille's hand with surprising strength. You have to publish everything, Sarah insisted, her voice hoarse but urgent. This isn't just about Malik anymore. It's about everyone who's been hurt by this system. Camille nodded, looking down at the thick manila folder in her lap. Sarah had managed to hide it behind a loose ceiling tile just before the attack. Are you sure you're up for the backlash this will cause? They already tried to silence me, Sarah said, touching the bandage on her forehead. That just proves we're on to something big. Back in her office, Camille spread the documents across her desk. Her hands trembled as she read through email after damning email. Franklin Moore's messages to police officers were explicit in their corruption. Change Martinez's statement to match the timeline we need. Make sure Williams' description fits our suspect. Remove any mention of the white suspect. The falsified police reports were even worse. Original witness statements had been altered, timestamps changed, and evidence logs manipulated. In one case, an officer had completely fabricated a witness who never existed. Camille's stomach churned as she realized the scope of the corruption. This wasn't just a few bad actors. It was an orchestrated system designed to target and convict innocent black men. The evidence showed dozens of cases where Franklin Moore had worked with corrupt officers to build false narratives. Her hands shaking, Camille picked up her phone and dialed Harold's number. When he answered, she could barely keep her voice steady. Judge Carmichael, I need you to see this right away, she said, shuffling through the papers. Sarah found proof of systemic corruption. Franklin Moore has been working with police officers to falsify evidence and witness statements. This isn't just about one prosecutor. It's an entire system. We need to prepare for a fight. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as Jaden Daniels stood before a growing crowd. His small frame seemed to grow taller as he gripped the microphone, his dark eyes scanning the faces before him. His voice trembled, but rang clear across the plaza, carrying the weight of 3 years of pain and determination. My name is Jaden, he began, his fingers tightening around the microphone stand. And my dad has been in prison for 3 years for something he didn't do. His words carried across the plaza where people had gathered with handmade signs demanding justice. Some signs swayed gently in the crisp October breeze, their messages bold against the cardboard. Free Malik and Justice Now. A woman in the front row, wearing a bright yellow sweater, nodded encouragingly. But from somewhere in the crowd came a harsh voice. Your daddy's where he belongs. Jaden's hands shook against the metal stand. He felt his cheeks burn hot as more hostile voices joined in, their words cutting through the autumn air like knives. Criminal. Like father. Like son. Go home, kid. Tears pricked at the corners of his eyes, threatening to spill over. But Jaden remembered his father's words during their last prison visit. Malik had leaned forward, his orange jumpsuit bright against the dull visiting room walls, and said firmly, "Stand tall, son. Truth is stronger than fear." Taking a deep breath that filled his chest, Jaden lifted his chin and spoke louder, his voice carrying over the muttering crowd. "My dad worked 2 jobs to take care of us. He missed my baseball games because he was working so hard at the warehouse and driving his taxi. He's not a criminal." The heckling continued, but supporters in the crowd began to shout back, their voices rising in defense. "Let him speak! Hear him out!" A group of college students near the back held their phones high, streaming the moment live. Jaden's voice grew stronger with each word, drawing strength from deep within. "My mom is sick because we can't afford food or medicine. My dad's in prison because he's black, not because he's guilty. The prosecutor lied. The police lied. And nobody cared because they thought nobody would listen to us." The crowd fell silent, the autumn wind whistling between buildings the only sound. Even the hecklers stopped, struck by the raw pain in the young boy's voice. A few birds circled overhead, their shadows dancing across the courthouse steps. "I'm not asking for pity," Jaden continued, his small shoulders squared. "I'm asking for justice. My dad deserves a fair trial. Every person deserves a fair trial, no matter what they look like or where they come from." People in the crowd began to nod, some wiping tears from their eyes with jacket sleeves. A group of mothers near the front, their own children clutching their hands, started chanting, "Justice for Malik! Justice for Malik!" The chant spread through the crowd like a wave, growing stronger with each repetition. Signs waved in the air, and more people joined the gathering, drawn by the commotion. The courthouse windows reflected the orange glow of the setting sun, creating a dramatic backdrop to the scene. From the corner of his eye, Jaden spotted Judge Harold Carmichael standing at the edge of the plaza, partially hidden behind a marble column. The judge's face was a mask of conflicting emotions: pride, shame, determination, and fear, all battling for dominance. His hands were clasped tightly behind his back, knuckles white with tension. As the rally reached its peak, with hundreds now chanting for justice, their voices echoing off the courthouse walls, Jaden's final words cut through the noise like a bell. "My dad is innocent, and I won't stop fighting until he comes home." The crowd erupted in applause and cheers, the sound thunderous in the plaza. People surged forward, wanting to shake Jaden's hand or offer words of support. Local news cameras captured everything, their red lights blinking in the growing dusk like artificial stars. Through it all, Jaden kept glancing at Judge Harold, who remained motionless at the edge of the crowd, watching. Their eyes met briefly across the distance, and in that moment, Jaden saw the weight of responsibility heavy on the judge's shoulders. The older man's face showed years of internal struggle bubbling to the surface. The rally concluded with a prayer led by a local pastor, his deep voice asking for justice and healing. As people began to disperse into the darkening evening, many stopped to leave their contact information with volunteers at folding tables, offering to help in whatever way they could. The energy had shifted from skepticism to solidarity, transformed by the courage of a 9-year-old boy who refused to be silenced. Judge Harold remained in his spot, his face conflicted as he watched the scene unfold before him. His fingers unconsciously traced the outline of the case file in his briefcase, Malik's case file, that he'd been reviewing late into the previous night. The late afternoon light filtered through dusty windows as Camille Harris stood on Wesley Carter's worn front porch, her heart pounding with anticipation. Her knuckles rapped against the peeling paint of the doorframe, and she adjusted her blazer, trying to look professional, despite the sweat beading on her forehead in the oppressive Georgia heat. A wind chime tinkled softly nearby, its gentle music at odds with her nerves. The door creaked open, revealing a weathered man in his 60s with deep lines etched around his mouth and eyes. Wesley Carter's eyes narrowed with suspicion as he took in her professional attire. "Can I help you?" "Mr. Carter, I'm Camille Harris. I'm an attorney working on Malik Daniels' case." She kept her voice steady, professional, though her fingers fidgeted with the strap of her leather briefcase. "May I come in?" Wesley's jaw tightened, the muscles working visibly beneath his salt and pepper stubble. He glanced over his shoulder as if checking for witnesses before reluctantly stepping aside, his movements stiff with hesitation. 5 minutes, that's all you get. The inside of his house felt frozen in time. Faded photographs of his corrections officer days lined the walls in crooked frames, and a television droned quietly in the background, the afternoon news barely audible. Wesley gestured to a worn armchair with frayed edges while he settled into his recliner, the leather crackling beneath his weight. "I know what you saw, Mr. Carter," Camille said quietly, meeting his guarded gaze. "I know you witnessed Franklin Moore coaching witnesses to lie about Malik Daniels." Wesley's weathered hands gripped the arms of his chair, his knuckles turning white. "That was a long time ago. I'm retired now. Don't want any trouble." A ceiling fan spun lazily overhead, stirring the stale air. "There's a 9-year-old boy who hasn't eaten a proper meal in weeks," Camille pressed, leaning forward, her voice thick with emotion. "His mother is sick, and they can't afford medical care, all because his father was wrongly imprisoned." "Look, what happened wasn't right," Wesley admitted, his voice rough like sandpaper. "But Moore has friends in high places. Speaking up could make things difficult for me. Real difficult." Camille pulled out her phone and showed Wesley a photo of Jaden at the recent rally, his small face determined and brave despite everything. "This is Malik's son, Jaden. He's been brave enough to stand up and fight for his father. But he needs help. Your help." Wesley stared at the photo, his expression softening, the hard lines around his mouth relaxing. "He looks like my grandson's age. Same look in his eyes, too. Jaden visits his father every chance he gets, even though sometimes they can't afford the bus fare." Camille's voice grew gentle, coaxing. "He believes in his father's innocence. He just needs others to believe, too." Wesley stood up suddenly, pacing the small living room, his shoes scuffing against the worn carpet. "I saw things during my time there, things that weren't right. Moore would come in, pull witnesses aside. I heard him threatening them, promising reduced sentences if they'd testify the way he wanted. Some of them were scared kids, barely adults." He stopped at the window, staring out at nothing, his shoulders hunched beneath his faded plaid shirt. "I kept quiet because I had a pension to think about, a family to support. But that boy—" He turned back to Camille, determination replacing fear in his eyes. "If I can help that boy, I'll do it. It's past time someone stood up to Moore." Camille pulled out a legal pad, her hand steady despite her racing heart. For the next hour, Wesley detailed everything he'd witnessed: dates, names, specific conversations. Each revelation painted a clearer picture of Franklin Moore's corruption. His testimony would be damning evidence against the prosecutor. As Camille prepared to leave, Wesley handed her his signed statement, his hand trembling slightly. "Make sure it counts," he said gruffly, emotion cracking through his tough exterior. "Make sure it helps that boy get his father back. No child should grow up without their dad because of a lie." Camille clutched the papers carefully, knowing she held crucial evidence that could help break open the case. The weight of Wesley's testimony felt both heavy and hopeful in her hands. "Thank you, Mr. Carter. Your testimony will make a difference. I promise you that." The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the courthouse windows as Jaden slipped past the busy secretaries and security guards. His small frame made it easy to dodge notice, especially during the bustling end of the workday, when everyone was focused on wrapping up their tasks and heading home. His heart pounded against his ribs as he approached Judge Harold's chambers, his worn sneakers silent on the polished floor that reflected the warm golden light. Through the partially open door, Jayden could see Harold hunched over his desk, surrounded by towering stacks of papers and legal documents. The judge's reading glasses sat low on his nose as he flipped through what Jayden recognized as his father's case file, his weathered fingers tracing each line with careful attention. Taking a deep breath that made his shoulders rise and fall, Jayden pushed the door open wider. "You promised to help us," he said, his voice shaking despite his attempt to sound brave. His hands twisted the hem of his threadbare t-shirt, a nervous habit he'd developed since his father's arrest. Harold's head snapped up, surprise flickering across his face before softening into understanding. He removed his glasses and gestured to the plush chair across from his desk. "Come in, Jayden. Please." Jayden shuffled forward, sinking into the leather chair that seemed to swallow his small frame. The leather creaked beneath him as he shifted uncomfortably. "It's been weeks," he continued, his eyes fixed on the case file. "Mom's getting sicker, and Dad's still—" His voice cracked on the last word. "I haven't forgotten my promise," Harold said gently, leaning forward with his elbows on the desk. "I'll do everything I can. In fact, I've been working on your father's case every day, sometimes late into the night." Jayden's eyes filled with tears that caught the afternoon light. "Really?" Harold stood up and walked around his desk, his footsteps echoing in the quiet chamber as he settled into the chair next to Jayden. "You know, Jayden, when I was about your age, something similar happened to my family." He paused, his voice growing softer, heavy with memory. "My father worked at a factory on the east side of town. One day, money went missing from the office safe. Because my father was one of the few black employees with access to that area, they immediately accused him without even considering anyone else." Jayden's eyes widened, recognition flooding his face. "Just like my dad?" Harold nodded, his own eyes growing distant with memory, the wrinkles around them deepening. "They arrested him right there at work, in front of everyone. I remember watching them put handcuffs on him, just like they did to your father. My mother cried for days. We had no money for food, no way to pay rent. The neighbors brought us casseroles, but pride made it hard to accept help." "What happened?" Jayden whispered, leaning forward in his chair. "A security guard finally came forward with evidence that cleared my father. But those weeks he spent in jail, they changed him, changed all of us." Harold's voice grew thick with emotion, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "That's why I became a judge, Jayden. To try to make things right. To make sure other families don't go through what mine did. To change the system from within." Jayden reached out hesitantly and placed his small hand on Harold's arm, his touch gentle but firm. "Is that why you're helping us?" "Yes," Harold replied, covering Jayden's hand with his own, feeling the boy's warmth through his suit jacket. "And I promise you, I won't stop until we get justice for your father, no matter what it takes." For the first time in weeks, a genuine smile spread across Jayden's face, lighting up his features. He stood up, his shoulders straighter, his chin held higher. "Thank you, Judge Harold. Thank you for understanding." As Jayden left the chambers, his footsteps fading down the corridor, Harold watched him go, feeling the weight of his duty settle more firmly on his shoulders. The memory of his father's wrongful arrest, combined with Jayden's unwavering faith in him, strengthened his resolve to right this wrong. He turned back to his desk, pulled the case file closer, and picked up his pen. There was work to be done. The morning light filtered through the courthouse's tall windows as Franklin Moore strode into the courtroom, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor with purposeful steps. His perfectly pressed charcoal suit and confident demeanor couldn't mask the cold calculation in his eyes as he approached the bench with a thick document in hand, his movements precise and practiced like a predator stalking its prey. "Your Honor," Franklin began, his voice carrying the practiced smoothness of a career prosecutor, honey-coated yet somehow devoid of warmth. "I'm filing this motion to dismiss the reopening of the Daniels case." He handed the document to the clerk with a flourish, who passed it to Judge Harold with slightly trembling hands. Harold's face remained impassive as he scanned the motion's contents, years of judicial experience evident in his measured demeanor. The courtroom fell silent, the tension palpable as observers leaned forward in their seats, the only sound the gentle whir of the ceiling fans overhead. Camille sat at the defense table, her jaw clenched and fingers drumming quietly against her legal pad as she watched Franklin's performance with growing unease. "Furthermore," Franklin continued, his tone taking on an edge of condescension that seemed to chill the air around him, "Judge Carmichael's personal involvement with the defendant's son demonstrates clear bias. This compromises the integrity of our judicial system." His words dripped with false concern for justice. Harold looked up from the motion, his eyes meeting Franklin's with unwavering intensity. The prosecutor's words hung in the air like a challenge, heavy with unspoken threats. Several moments passed as Harold removed his reading glasses and placed them carefully on the bench, the metal frames making a soft click against the wood. "Mr. Moore," Harold's voice was steady and firm, carrying to every corner of the hushed courtroom, "this court has reviewed your motion thoroughly." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the courtroom like a searchlight. "And I find your arguments without merit." Franklin's confident smile faltered slightly, a crack appearing in his perfectly crafted facade. "Your Honor, with all due respect—" "This court," Harold continued, cutting him off with the authority of someone who had finally found their moral compass, "will not protect those who abuse the law." His voice carried the weight of decades on the bench, but also something more, a moral certainty that seemed to fill the room and strengthen the resolve of everyone who witnessed it. Franklin's face darkened like storm clouds gathering on the horizon as he realized his usual tactics wouldn't work. His hands gripped the podium tightly, knuckles whitening beneath his tanned skin. The glare he directed at Harold spoke volumes about the battle lines being drawn, a silent declaration of war between justice and power. Harold straightened in his chair, his authority radiating from the bench like a physical force. "I hereby set a hearing date for next Monday to officially reopen the case of Malik Daniels." He picked up his gavel with deliberate care. "This court will examine all evidence, both old and new, to ensure justice is served. That is non-negotiable." The sharp crack of the gavel echoed through the courtroom like a thunderclap, marking the beginning of what promised to be a fierce legal battle. Franklin Moore stood rigid at the podium, his mask of professionalism barely concealing his fury as the judge's words sealed his motion's fate. His fingers flexed against the wooden surface, betraying the rage simmering beneath his composed exterior. Sarah Blake sat propped up in her hospital bed, her laptop balanced carefully on the rolling table in front of her. Despite the bandage on her head and the lingering pain from her attack, her fingers moved swiftly across the keyboard. The steady beeping of medical monitors provided a rhythm to her investigation as she dug deeper into Franklin Moore's digital trail. Her eyes widened as she opened another batch of emails. "Got you," she whispered, scrolling through message after message between Moore and executives from private prison companies. The documents revealed a disturbing pattern: financial transactions disguised as consulting fees, followed by spikes in conviction rates. Sarah's hands trembled as she pulled up Malik's case file. There it was. His conviction coincided perfectly with one of the largest payments Moore had received. She found an email from Moore to a prison executive. "Meeting our quarterly targets. The Daniels case will help boost numbers." More documents painted an even darker picture. Moore had systematically targeted black defendants, knowing they were less likely to have resources for a proper defense. Sarah's stomach churned as she uncovered internal memos discussing demographic quotas and conviction efficiency. The evidence was overwhelming. Spreadsheets tracked conviction rates by race, with bonuses tied to maintaining high percentages of black inmates. Moore had created detailed profiles of ideal targets, young black men from low-income neighborhoods just like Malik. Sarah's face paled as she discovered a pattern of fabricated evidence. Police reports were altered, witness statements manipulated, and evidence suppressed, all to secure quick convictions. Each case represented another life destroyed, another family torn apart. She printed everything, her hands shaking with a mixture of anger and determination. The stack of papers grew thick with damning evidence: bank statements, emails, internal memos, and statistical analyses that revealed the true scope of Moore's operation. When Harold arrived at the hospital, Sarah was sitting up straighter, despite her injuries. The evidence lay organized in folders on her lap. Her voice was steady, but filled with controlled fury as she handed him the first file. "This isn't just corruption," she said, watching Harold's face as he began reading. "It's a machine designed to crush people like Malik." Harold's expression grew increasingly grim as he turned page after page, seeing the full extent of Moore's systemic discrimination laid bare in black and white. The hospital room was quiet except for the soft murmur of the television mounted on the wall. Elaine Daniels lay propped up against white pillows, her thin frame made frailer by weeks of malnutrition, but her eyes were bright and alert as she watched the news unfold. On screen, crowds of protesters filled the streets outside the courthouse, their signs bobbing like waves in the sea of people. "Justice for Malik," they chanted. "End systemic racism." The camera panned across faces of all colors, united in their demand for change. The news anchor's voice was solemn as she detailed Sarah Blake's explosive investigation. Documents reveal a disturbing pattern of racial targeting and corruption within the prosecutor's office. Franklin Moore is accused of accepting bribes from private prison companies. Tears welled up in Elaine's eyes as photographs of Malik appeared on screen. She reached out and touched the TV screen, her fingers trembling as they traced the outline of her husband's face. The image showed him before his arrest, smiling, proud, free. The door creaked open, and Jaden stepped in, carrying a small bouquet of wildflowers he'd picked from the hospital garden. "Mom," he said softly, placing the flowers in a plastic cup by her bedside. "How are you feeling?" Elaine turned to her son, her eyes glistening. "Better now that you're here." She patted the edge of her bed, and Jaden carefully sat down beside her. Together, they watched as more details of the investigation unfolded on screen. "Look at all those people," Jaden whispered, watching the protesters. "They're all fighting for Dad now." Elaine reached for Jaden's hand, squeezing it weakly. Her voice cracked with emotion as she spoke. "You've done so much for us, Jaden," she said, tears spilling onto her cheeks. "Your father would be proud." Jaden's own eyes filled with tears as he looked at his mother. Despite her illness, despite everything they'd been through, she still radiated love and strength. He thought about all the nights she'd gone hungry so he could eat, all the time she'd hidden her pain behind a brave smile. "I won't stop until Dad is home," Jaden promised, his young voice steady and determined. He held his mother's hand tighter, both of them drawing strength from each other as they watched justice slowly begin to unfold on the screen before them. Franklin Moore stalked through the courthouse corridors, his normally pristine suit looking slightly rumpled, his face tight with barely contained rage. He cornered Wesley Carter near the water fountain, towering over the retired prison guard. "You really want to throw away your pension over this?" Franklin's voice was low and menacing. "Think about what you're doing, Wesley. One word from me, and everything you worked for disappears." Wesley's hands trembled as he gripped his cane, but he stood his ground. "I've kept quiet too long already," he said, though his voice wavered. "What you did to that man, to his family, it ain't right." Franklin's eyes narrowed. "Nobody will believe the word of a washed-up guard over a respected prosecutor." Later that afternoon, Franklin held an impromptu press conference on the courthouse steps. Camera lights flashed as he adjusted his tie and adopted his most convincing courtroom demeanor. "Judge Carmichael and Ms. Harris are conducting a witch hunt," he declared, his voice carrying across the crowd. "Their obvious bias against my office and their misconduct in pursuing this case should concern every citizen who values justice." Inside courtroom 3B, Camille stood before Judge Thompson, her shoulders squared and her voice steady despite her anger. The gallery was packed with reporters and community members, all leaning forward to catch every word. "Your Honor," she said, gesturing to the evidence files spread before her, "Mr. Moore's accusations are desperate attempts to distract from the truth. The only bias here is the systemic prejudice that destroyed this man's life." She held up document after document. "We have evidence of falsified police reports, coerced testimonies, and financial records showing suspicious payments. This isn't about bias, it's about justice." Whispers rippled through the courtroom as more witnesses came forward. A former clerk described watching Franklin alter evidence. A police officer admitted to being pressured to change his testimony. Each new revelation chipped away at Franklin's carefully constructed facade. In his office that evening, Franklin loosened his tie and poured himself a drink with shaking hands. His phone wouldn't stop buzzing with calls from reporters and former colleagues distancing themselves from the scandal. On his desk, newspapers screamed headlines about corruption and systemic racism. He watched through his window as protesters gathered outside, their signs visible even in the growing darkness. The crowd had grown larger each day, their chants echoing off the building's stone walls. Public opinion was shifting rapidly, and he could feel his grip on power slipping away. His secretary buzzed in. "Sir, the Bar Association is requesting an emergency meeting about your license to practice." Franklin's glass slipped from his fingers, shattering on the floor. As he stared at the spreading liquid, he realized that his carefully constructed world was crumbling, piece by piece, just like the broken glass at his feet. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as hundreds of people gathered, their signs waving like a forest of hope and determination. "Justice for Malik!" they chanted, their voices echoing off the granite walls. Community leaders, activists, and families stood shoulder to shoulder, united in their demand for change. At the center of it all stood Jayden Daniels, his small frame elevated by a wooden box behind the microphone. Though his clothes were still worn, he carried himself with newfound confidence. The crowd fell silent as he began to speak. "My dad missed my last 3 birthdays," Jayden said, his voice clear and strong despite his trembling hands. "He wasn't there when Mom got sick or when our lights got turned off. But he's not absent because he chose to leave. He's gone because the system took him from us." Tears glistened in the eyes of many listeners as Jayden continued. "Mr. Moore didn't just lock up my dad. He locked up our future, our happiness, our family, but we're not giving up. My dad is innocent, and now everyone knows it." From his position on the courthouse steps, Judge Harold Carmichael watched the scene unfold. His judicial robes felt heavy on his shoulders as he observed the sea of faces, black, white, young, old, all united in their call for justice. A lump formed in his throat as he watched Jaden, remembering the frightened, hungry boy who had first stumbled into his courtroom. "Look at what this child has done," Harold murmured to himself, noting how the media cameras swiveled between Jaden and the crowd. Signs bearing Malik's face dotted the gathering, along with others showing victims of similar wrongful convictions. The community leaders took turns speaking, each one highlighting different aspects of the systemic discrimination that had plagued their justice system. But it was Jaden's words that seemed to resonate most deeply, his personal story putting a human face on the statistics and legal jargon. "My dad taught me that telling the truth matters," Jaden's voice rang out. "He taught me to stand up for what's right, even when it's scary. That's what I'm doing now. Standing up for him, for my mom, for everyone who's been hurt by people like Mr. Moore." Harold felt a profound shift in his spirit as he watched. This wasn't just a protest, it was an awakening. The people before him weren't just demanding change, they were creating it, led by the courage of a 9-year-old boy who refused to give up on his father. As the crowd's chants grew louder, Harold noticed how the courthouse employees had stopped to watch from windows and doorways. Even the usually bustling legal proceedings seemed to have paused, as if the building itself was listening to the voice of justice rising from below. "This is what justice should look like," Harold whispered to himself, his words nearly lost in the swell of voices calling for change. The courtroom buzzed with nervous energy as people packed the wooden benches. Every seat was filled, with observers standing along the walls. Camille Harris stood at the podium, her dark blue suit crisp and professional, though her hands trembled slightly as she arranged her documents. Franklin Moore sat at the defense table, his usual smugness replaced by a tight-lipped frown. His expensive tie seemed to choke him as he tugged at his collar repeatedly. "Your Honor," Camille began, her voice steady and clear, "what happened to Malik Daniels wasn't just a miscarriage of justice. It was part of a calculated system designed to target and imprison black men for profit." She held up a thick folder of documents. "We have testimony from Wesley Carter, a former corrections officer, who witnessed Mr. Moore coaching witnesses to lie under oath." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Wesley Carter, sitting in the front row, nodded solemnly. His weathered face showed the weight of years keeping this secret. "Furthermore," Camille continued, projecting emails onto the courtroom screen, investigative journalist Sarah Blake uncovered direct communications between Mr. Moore's office and private prison companies. She paused, letting the evidence sink in. "These emails show a clear pattern of targeting black defendants, rushing their cases through the system with minimal evidence." Franklin's face grew increasingly pale as Camille methodically laid out the evidence. His leg bounced nervously under the table, a far cry from his usual confident demeanor. "In Mr. Daniels' case specifically," Camille said, her voice growing passionate, "the only evidence was a vague description of a black male in the area. No weapon was found. No stolen goods were recovered. Yet Mr. Moore pushed for maximum sentencing." The audience gasped as Camille revealed photographs of doctored police reports. "These documents show systematic alteration of witness statements, all under Mr. Moore's direction." Judge Harold Carmichael leaned forward in his chair, his expression grave as he studied the evidence. The weight of his own role in this system seemed to press down on his shoulders. Franklin's attorney scribbled frantically on his legal pad, occasionally whispering urgently to his client. The evidence mounted like an unstoppable wave, threatening to drown them both. "This wasn't just about one case or one man," Camille declared, her voice ringing with conviction. "This was about feeding a system that profited from destroying black families and communities." She played a recording of Wesley Carter's testimony. "I saw Mr. Moore tell witnesses what to say, word for word. He said if they didn't cooperate, they'd face charges themselves. Franklin's composure finally cracked. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple as he loosened his tie further. His hand shook as he reached for his water glass. His attorney stood abruptly. "Your Honor, we request a brief recess to review this new evidence and prepare an appropriate response." The request came as no surprise to anyone in the courtroom. The mountain of evidence Camille had presented was overwhelming, and Franklin's team was clearly scrambling to find any way to counter it. Wesley Carter approached the witness stand, his weathered hands gripping the railing as he was sworn in. Though his work-worn fingers trembled slightly, his voice rang clear and strong through the hushed courtroom. "I worked as a corrections officer at State Prison for 23 years, Wesley began, adjusting his collar. "I saw a lot of things I wish I hadn't." Camille stepped forward. "Can you tell us about what you witnessed regarding Malik Daniels' case?" Wesley's eyes flickered briefly to Franklin Moore before settling back on Camille. "It was late one evening, maybe around 7. I was doing my rounds when I heard voices from one of the interview rooms. Mr. Moore was there with a witness. Tommy Jenkins, I believe his name was." The courtroom remained silent as Wesley continued, his voice growing stronger. Mr. Moore was telling him exactly what to say, word for word, like he was coaching an actor. He told Jenkins to say he saw Mr. Daniels running from the scene, even though Jenkins had already said he wasn't sure who he saw. Franklin's attorney shot to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. This is hearsay." "Overruled," the judge responded firmly. "Continue, Mr. Carter." Wesley straightened in his chair. When Jenkins hesitated, Moore threatened him, said he'd make sure Jenkins faced charges of his own if he didn't cooperate. "I saw this happen with other witnesses, too. It wasn't just once." In the gallery, Jaden sat next to his mother, Elaine, both of them hanging on every word. Elaine's thin fingers gripped her son's hand tightly. Franklin's attorney approached for cross-examination, his expensive suit matching his sharp tone. "Mr. Carter, why didn't you report these alleged incidents when they occurred?" "I was afraid," Wesley admitted, his shoulders sagging slightly. "I had a family to support, retirement coming up. Moore had connections everywhere. But I couldn't live with it anymore. Not after seeing what happened to the Daniels family." "Isn't it true you were passed over for promotion 3 times?" the defense attorney pressed. "Couldn't this testimony be motivated by bitterness?" Wesley's eyes flashed. "Sir, I've lost sleep for years knowing what I saw. I'm here because that man," he pointed at Franklin, "deliberately sent an innocent man to prison. I saw him do it. I heard him threaten witnesses. And I can't stay silent anymore." The defense attorney tried several more angles to discredit Wesley, but each attempt seemed to make Wesley's testimony stronger, more genuine. His simple, honest answers carried more weight than any clever legal maneuvering. "Mr. Carter," Camille asked on redirect, "are you aware of the consequences of perjury?" "Yes, ma'am," Wesley replied firmly. "Everything I've said here is the truth. I swear on my life." The judge leaned forward, studying Wesley carefully before speaking. "The testimony of Wesley Carter will be entered into the official record." He paused, looking directly at Franklin Moore. "This court finds Mr. Carter's testimony both credible and admissible." A collective exhale seemed to sweep through the courtroom. Elaine wiped tears from her eyes as Jaden squeezed her hand. The truth about what happened to Malik was finally coming to light. Camille Harris stood at the podium, her shoulders straight as she presented the damning evidence. Beside her, Sarah Blake sat ready with stacks of meticulously organized financial documents. "Your Honor, these bank records show regular deposits to an offshore account registered to Franklin Moore," Camille stated, her voice clear and steady. The deposits aligned perfectly with conviction dates in major cases, including Malik Daniels. Sarah handed more documents to the bailiff, who distributed them to the judge and defense team. The papers rustled through the silent courtroom as everyone examined the evidence. Furthermore, Camille continued, we have emails between Mr. Moore and executives at Private Corrections Corporation discussing conviction quotas and demographic targets. Franklin Moore shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his face reddening. His attorney leaned over to whisper something, but Franklin waved him off irritably. Mr. Moore, Camille addressed him directly as he took the stand, can you explain why you received $50,000 3 days after Malik Daniels' conviction? That was a consulting fee, Franklin snapped, his usual smooth demeanor cracking. A consulting fee from a shell company traced back to Private Corrections Corporation? Camille pressed. The same company that profits from high incarceration rates? Franklin's jaw clenched. Sweat beaded on his forehead under the courtroom lights. You don't understand how things work, he said, his voice rising. Someone has to maintain order. By falsifying evidence? By coercing witnesses? Camille's questions came rapid fire now. By targeting black men like Malik Daniels? I did what needed to be done, Franklin suddenly shouted, slamming his hand on the witness stand. His face had turned purple with rage. You naive fool! Do you think the system runs on good intentions? Someone has to fill those cells. Someone has to keep the machine running. Gas echoed through the courtroom. Jaden and Elaine clutched each other's hands, their eyes wide. Harold leaned forward in his seat, his expression grim but vindicated. Franklin seemed to realize what he'd done. He slumped in the witness chair, his outburst hanging in the air like a confession. The judge's gavel cracked through the stunned silence. Bailiff, take Mr. Moore into custody. He is to be held pending an investigation into corruption charges. The judge's voice was steel. This court will take a 1-hour recess. As the bailiff approached with handcuffs, Franklin sat motionless, all his arrogance finally stripped away. The courtroom erupted in shocked whispers and exclamations while Franklin was led away, his head bowed for the first time since the trial began. The courtroom buzzed with nervous energy as Judge Martinez settled into his chair. The room was packed, with every bench filled and people standing along the walls. Jaden sat in the front row, his hands clasped tightly together, while Elaine held his shoulders. In the matter of State versus Malik Daniels, Judge Martinez began, his voice echoing through the hushed chamber, this court has reviewed substantial new evidence that casts doubt on the original conviction. Jaden's heart pounded so hard he could barely breathe. He felt his mother's grip tighten on his shoulders. The documentation provided by Ms. Harris and Ms. Blake has revealed serious misconduct in the prosecution of this case, the judge continued. Furthermore, the testimony of Mr. Wesley Carter and the financial records presented demonstrate a pattern of systemic corruption that directly affected Mr. Daniels' trial. The judge paused, looking directly at Malik, who stood tall despite his prison jumpsuit. Mr. Daniels, this court finds that your conviction was obtained through fraudulent means and prosecutorial misconduct. Therefore, I am overturning your conviction and declaring you innocent of all charges. The words hung in the air for a brief moment before their meaning sank in. Jaden leaped from his seat, tears streaming down his face. Malik turned to his son, his own eyes glistening. Dad! Jaden cried out, running past the courtroom barrier. No one tried to stop him as he threw himself into his father's arms. Malik wrapped his arms around his son, lifting him off the ground. We're free, he whispered into Jaden's ear, his voice thick with emotion. We're finally free. The courtroom erupted in cheers and applause. People stood, hugging each other and crying. Elaine joined her husband and son, and the family held each other tightly, years of pain and separation dissolving in their embrace. Judge Harold Carmichael sat back in his chair, watching the scene unfold before him. Tears welled in his eyes as he observed the family reunion. The weight of years of complicity in an unjust system lifted from his shoulders, replaced by the warmth of knowing he had helped right a terrible wrong. The applause continued to thunder through the courtroom, a celebration not just of Malik's freedom, but of justice finally served. Sarah Blake and Camille Harris hugged each other, their hard work and courage vindicated in this moment of triumph. Through his tears, Harold watched Jaden's face buried in his father's chest, saw the boy's shoulders shaking with sobs of joy. The scene before him represented everything he had dreamed of when he first decided to become a judge: true justice, healing, and hope restored. Sarah Blake's exposé, titled "Justice for Sale: The Corruption of Franklin Moore," sent shockwaves through the nation. Major news networks picked up the story, broadcasting footage of peaceful protesters gathering in cities across America. Outside courthouses from New York to Los Angeles, people held signs reading "Free Them All" and "End Systemic Racism." The Justice Department launched investigations into dozens of cases Franklin Moore had prosecuted. Teams of lawyers pored over old files, finding similar patterns of fabricated evidence and coerced testimonies. Each day brought new revelations of wrongful convictions, particularly among black defendants. Franklin Moore sat in a holding cell as charges mounted against him: obstruction of justice, witness tampering, accepting bribes, and civil rights violations. His once pristine reputation lay in tatters as former colleagues turned against him, offering testimony in exchange for leniency. The investigation spread like wildfire, exposing other corrupt officials. 3 police officers were arrested for falsifying reports. 2 judges faced ethics investigations for turning a blind eye. The private prison company's CEO resigned in disgrace after evidence emerged of systematic kickback schemes. Harold Carmichael watched it all unfold from his chambers, feeling both vindicated and heavy-hearted. After sleepless nights of reflection, he made his decision. At a hastily called press conference, reporters packed the courthouse steps as Harold approached the podium. "For 30 years, I've served on this bench," he began, his voice steady but emotional. "I believed I was upholding justice, but I was wrong. I was part of a system that perpetuated inequality and turned a blind eye to corruption." The cameras flashed as Harold removed his judicial robe. "Today, I'm stepping down from the bench. The system needs reform, and I can do more for justice outside these walls. Sometimes, real change requires us to step away from what we know and fight from a different angle." Later that afternoon, Harold drove to the Daniels' new apartment. The family had moved to a better neighborhood thanks to a settlement from the city. When Malik opened the door, the smell of home-cooked meals wafted out. Elaine's health had improved dramatically since Malik's return, and she was cooking again. "Judge Carmichael," Malik said warmly, extending his hand. "Just Harold now," he replied, stepping inside. Jaden ran to greet him with a hug, no longer the frightened boy who had first entered his courtroom. The family gathered in their small living room, where Harold shared his plans to start a nonprofit organization focused on overturning wrongful convictions. "This is only the beginning of real change," he told them, his eyes bright with purpose. "What happened to your family can never happen again." The Daniels Family Community Center stood proudly on Cherry Street, its freshly painted walls gleaming in the morning sun. The renovated building, once abandoned and deteriorating, now housed hope within its walls. Colorful banners announcing the grand opening fluttered in the breeze as families began gathering outside. Malik, dressed in a crisp blue suit, stood at the entrance greeting people with warm handshakes and genuine smiles. Beside him, Elaine radiated health and happiness, a far cry from the frail woman she'd been just months ago. Her eyes sparkled as she welcomed each visitor, especially those who carried similar burdens to what her family had endured. Inside, Jaden darted from room to room, making sure everything was perfect. He straightened the chairs in the counseling area, adjusted the computers in the Legal Resource Center, and checked on the children's playroom one last time. His teenage frame had filled out since those hungry days, but his eyes still held that same determined spirit. The crowd grew as community members filed in, filling the main hall with excited chatter. Harold arrived early, looking relaxed in casual clothes rather than his former judicial robes. Camille followed shortly after, carrying a large bouquet of flowers for Elaine. Sarah Blake, still walking with a slight limp from her attack, but her journalist's notepad ready, completed the trio of honored guests. "Welcome, everyone," Mullock's voice carried across the room as he stepped up to the podium. The crowd fell silent, all eyes on the man whose story had sparked a movement. 5 years ago, I sat in a prison cell, separated from my family, wrongly convicted of a crime I didn't commit. Today, I stand before you not as a victim, but as a survivor. His words resonated through the hall as he continued, "This center isn't just about my story. It's about all our stories. It's about turning our pain into purpose." He gestured to the various rooms. "Here, families will find legal resources, counseling, support groups, and most importantly, hope. Because no child should go hungry while their parent sits wrongly imprisoned. No spouse should face illness alone. No family should be torn apart by injustice." Elaine wiped tears from her eyes as Malik acknowledged their supporters. To Judge Harold Carmichael, who had the courage to question the system he served. To Camille Harris, who fought tirelessly for truth. To Sarah Blake, who risked everything to expose corruption. And to my son, Jaden, my hero, who never stopped believing in me. After the speech, families explored the center, connecting with others who shared similar experiences. Children laughed in the playroom, while parents consulted with volunteer lawyers in the resource center. The atmosphere buzzed with possibility and healing. As the afternoon sun began to set, Jaden stood on the front steps of the center. He watched children playing in the small courtyard, their parents chatting nearby, sharing stories and support. The sight filled his heart with pride and purpose. "We did it," he whispered to himself, his words carried away by the gentle breeze. The community center hummed with activity, a living, breathing testament to resilience and hope, standing as a beacon for all those still fighting for justice. If you enjoyed the story of Jaden Daniels, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.